Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erika Schiller, and I'm joined by my ClimeCo colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together. Hello everyone and welcome to ESG Decoded. My name is Anna Stablum and I work for ClimeCo in Singapore. I'm your host today, and with me in the studio I have Alex Cox, Managing Director and Head of Carbon Markets at ERM, or Environmental Resource Management. Hi Alex.
Anna. Hey, how you doing?
Alex is joining us from Germany, and I also have the pleasure to introduce his colleague, Andy Yap, who sits in Singapore with me, and he's a regional lead for carbon markets. Thank you, Andy, for joining the podcast, and it's great to have you both here. I'm so excited to have ERM with us here at ESG Decoded because it's a very well-known name in the industry. It is the world's largest specialist sustainability consultancy, and it has recently extended its carbon market services with the launch of ERM Climate Markets. And we're here today to discuss how corporates are faring in this pretty tricky environment where the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement and many companies are shying away from carbon credits and even sustainability commitments. Even the term ESG is being debated if you can use it or not. And we're seeing many alliances like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero losing members as companies and banks are pulling out. It is a concerning pattern, and today we will talk about how we can support companies to continue with their net zero or low carbon future journeys and why this is so important. So in order to break it down to a little bit of smaller pieces, I would like to start with you, Alex. Would you mind giving our listeners a little bit of background of who you are and what your role is at ERM?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So hi, I'm Alex Cox. I've been in ERM for 20 years and I'm a partner and lead the carbon markets team. We see a constant market influx around the carbon markets, both on compliance and also in the voluntary markets. And ERM's aim is to help our clients navigate decarbonization, energy resilience, etc. And carbon markets and access to the right types of carbon credits is important for our clients, both protection but also potential opportunities. So we have a global team to align with our clients and help them on their journeys.
And I love the fact that last time we spoke, we were talking about your background in the financial services industry. You both come from the financial services industry. And I remember we talked a lot about risk. Do you mind sharing with us how do you see sustainability in the lens of risk? Because I thought that was fascinating, the way that you look at it, not from necessarily a good to have, but really in terms of a risk perspective.
Yeah. In the last months, it's been quite a turmoil around the market in general. And we see, as you know, as mentioned, with some of the changes going on in the US and some what could be seen as watered down some regulation within Europe on moving into the omnibus legislation. And I think where we've seen kind of that adds complexity to clients and customers and corporates in the world, and also the flow of capital. So what's happening within the market as we see it is that you've got a sort of different worlds that are appearing. Sometimes in some regions and countries, sustainability loses. So i.e. the term perhaps ESG or other types of references are being pulled back on, and companies are sometimes maybe a bit afraid to be using it. The risks are still there. Like you can't get away from it. If you've got contamination or environmental issues or customer preferences, if you don't react to it, there's a reality of the commercial outcome. There's also other areas where compliance is really booming. So some jurisdictions, ETS schemes and tax schemes are being driven by governments. And therefore, companies that are prepared for that change and are aligning their budgets and 5-year plans to those agendas can also navigate that and also make it as an opportunity, i.e. reducing some liabilities or preparing their products and R&D to be prepared for those markets and to be more accessible to both export and as well as import. Some areas, you've got this patchwork, and we call this a multipolar world, where it's a patchwork of some compliance and some completely voluntary. And again, it depends very locally in the country where you can operate and where you can get credits. I think maybe Andy talk a little bit around the Singapore and their approach to carbon markets. Perhaps that's a good input.
Sure, Alex. So I think from an Asia context, Singapore remains very committed to the carbon mitigation agenda. We see ecosystem enablers. We see capital being diverted, whether through grants or even we see good policy integration with other emerging countries, be it Africa, intra-Asia, Latin America, on signing bilaterals, MOUs to ensure that there is enough supply and demand to support the broader carbon reduction initiatives. And also the fact that the nexus between finance and carbon is also becoming a lot more apparent. And I think that could be a good indicator of things turning around, in that once carbon becomes more a commoditized or mainstream financial quantification exercise, then naturally, the ecosystem, the expertise, the governance is all already in place, well structured for it to flourish. So overall, I think governments in the region have stayed the course, whether from a regulatory disclosure perspective, sticking to maybe next 2-3 years, disclosing sustainability related components, that there is no rollback on that front. There will also likely be new carbon tax regimes in the region following suit from Singapore, perhaps Malaysia, Thailand. We have seen early signs that this will be rolling out soon, and also perhaps even some ETS mechanisms, or where ETSs have already existed in, say, China, Japan, broadening out to other sectors or other industries to ensure that there's no one being left without the possibility of hiding away from emissions. So I think the fact that there's a more broad initiative to ensure that all sectors of economies are moving along the broader mitigation agenda, that is fairly encouraging. So yeah, happy to elaborate more on that. But back to you, Anna, for now.
No, I appreciate that. No, that's interesting. I think what we're seeing is, of course, some priorities have changed over the past year for some of the companies that are faced maybe with energy security issues. There's inflation worries. And at the same time as what you're saying, Andy, is that we're seeing a lot of measures going on in various regions where we are building out a carbon framework. And I think the key thing here is really to put a price on carbon, whether that comes from an ETS, if it comes from having an internal carbon price. And I would want to hear your views on that, Alex, coming from that financial services industry background and understanding why is that so important to have a price of carbon, and how can we support companies even to maybe have an internal carbon price, or that they get used to price this externality that is pollution.
Yeah. Your word at the end there, Anna, pollution, is exactly right. There's hazardous chemicals and waste that has to be processed, and that has a price per ton to be processed depending on the countries where they are. And to have a fair level playing field across the world on products, it is just another hazardous waste. And the reality, whether we talk about frameworks or compliance or voluntary, the reality is forests are burning at a higher rate. There is a lack of water. There are greater storms and damage, and insurance claims are the highest it's ever been. So there is just simply a reality that doesn't matter what's happening on the press or in the media, you look out the door in many places and it's real. And I think that means in parts per million within the atmosphere needs to come down, it needs to be slowed, and it needs to come down. And the only way to do that is it needs to be treated as the waste, and it is that through a carbon price. Now you have mechanisms like CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe, that has basically created a playing field on selling products within the European sphere in the future. It hasn't fully come in, but it will do over the next 5 years. And that price will allow a consumer, knowing when they're buying a product, that it's even in terms of the waste. You don't just export your waste where you don't pay for it and it just goes into the atmosphere. We all share the same air. So all of this coming together, and then with an ETS scheme and allowing intensity of carbon in products to be measured and then disclosed and then penalized, actually, if it hasn't been used, I think is most likely the natural outcome globally, because I think you can have it with other commodities or other types of pricing. And therefore, I think that will come. Now, companies would need to prepare for that. You can see that. Maybe, Andy, you can talk a bit about Malaysia and how they're seeing that. And why would an economy like Malaysia, for example, pay the European Union money on certificates to access the market? Why not decarbonize your own economy? And it makes complete sense. Why give the money away? Why not use it yourself? Maybe, Andy, yeah.
You want to touch on that, Andy?
Yeah, so generally, I think the good thing about the recent bout of tariffs, about it being a curveball, is that tariffs have sort of taken shape in a different way through putting a price on carbon, as you alluded to, Anna. And I think this is for the betterment of the world in an interesting sense that, the cost of carbon should not be arbitraged away anymore. And what I'm referring to is, the increasing prevalence of carbon tax that I talked about, or compliance schemes under the polluter pay principle. But even CBAM, right, in itself is also, discouraging kicking emissions to the global south. We're looking at regional policymakers looking seriously or accelerating perhaps the thought of having carbon taxes internally first, so that exporters can demonstrate that, the cost of carbon has already been factored in. And this, in a sense, also presents opportunities, perhaps additional revenue versus, having the importer in Europe paying for that. So this bout of shock through the tariffs, interestingly, be perhaps a wake-up call for all companies to incorporate some form of ICP, internal carbon pricing, or some form of tax assumptions into their standard cash flow analysis forecast to really stress test their business model, whether it will be viable 10, 50 years down the road. So I think definitely companies have started to wake up to the idea that, even if protectionist tariffs are out of the picture, and there is indeed a new form of tariffs, or what I would say, the price of carbon is just around the corner, and they need to be prepared to pay for that. And that in turn should encourage, I would say, regional collaborations or even regional policymakers to sort of accelerate the ETS or carbon tax agenda.
If we continue with the carbon tax from Europe and CBAM, as it's called, are people now, companies coming to you here in Southeast Asia and asking for help from ERM on how to think about this, how to structure their thought system? And of course, they need to start filling in and reporting if they are importing or basically exporting, and their clients in Europe are importing goods. And of course, they are asking for this kind of data. When you're seeing companies here in this region, are they complaining a little bit about, we're talking about justice and equity in this market as well, and that the European carbon price shouldn't be put on, say, Indonesian exporters or companies that operate in countries where GDP is a lot lower, where priorities are slightly different? Are you hearing any complaints or any pushback on the CBAM, or you think it's actually a good opportunity, like you mentioned, for governments to set up their own frameworks?
Yeah, I think from our side, indicatively, the CBAM has not been rolled out to its fullest intent and extent. So in that sense, a lot of the Asian exporters have not really felt the brunt of it. I would say the more progressive ones have started to ask on what are the products in scope. Potentially, if these new products get to be in scope of a CBAM paradigm, what would that mean? There's at least awareness that this is around the corner. And I think once regulations or once the full phase-in of CBAM kicks in across more sectors, then that would definitely generate more attention. So I think it's a bit hard to say because we are still in the perhaps early days as this gets phases in, but we are already seeing good interest, even from Asian corporates, to have a sense of what this means for their business financially.
I think the other dimension is, and this is where it connects all of the financial markets to what we're really talking about, is decarbonizing economies globally and providing public and private finance to make that happen. So if it is a high, so a low GDP economy, maybe in Asia or in Africa or somewhere where they are struggling to decarbonize their economy. And I think this is where mechanisms like the carbon markets, like other types of maybe public finance, are activated and then deployed into these economies to help them decarbonize what they're doing, whether it's coal or into solar or whichever technology they're looking at, is a fair solution to help them decarbonize. And then they can obviously not have to spend the money to then go and have the certificates to then reach those markets. Now, if it's not the EU CBAM that's driving it, there'll be others that come up and it will become the default. And therefore, you can wait, of course, but then you may be penalized later on with your export economy. So from our side, I think in terms of complaints, I think there's just a destination the world is going to, even in this turbulent world right now, and the train is going. And the question is, and you see this in the UAE, they're setting up a registry, companies beginning having to report. It's the first part of a disclosure reporting and then a trading cap scheme that then eventually will then lead to reporting those emissions, allowances, and then getting the intensity. So again, you see it everywhere. So I think it's systemic thinking the world needs, and it's around finance, decarbonizing economies, getting private sector also activated, perhaps through carbon markets as a mechanism, for example.
So this is interesting, right? Because it's like what you were saying there, that the train is already moving. If you complain or not, doesn't really matter. It's then about making the most of it, I think, and taking the opportunity that it comes with as well. And we see that a lot from our perspective as ClimeCo, and really talking about maybe you could use it, for example, in your marketing, that you will be a stronger company once you have started to decarbonize and are on that train journey. But I wanted to ask you, because I do find, especially in this region, Andy, there are still companies out there that have not taken the first steps, that are not counting their carbon footprint, for example. How do you, when you talk to companies in this region, because it does feel like Europe and the companies maybe that Alex is interacting with have already started and are way ahead on this train than maybe companies out here. How do you incentivize when you speak to companies to get started really from the beginning on their sustainability journey?
Admittedly, Asia is slightly lower in terms of maturity compared to Europe. Given the regulatory regime, there is no ETS, although in Singapore there is carbon tax. But more broadly, I think there is still a bit more of a reactive mindset. Perhaps a lot of companies are more focused on more compulsory or pertinent matters. So on that front, I typically give a reminder of what is looming ahead, just within the local regulatory context around sustainability disclosures. So I think more or less across the Asian landscape, governments are committed to the S1 and S2 or the equivalent sustainability disclosures. So that in itself, although it's a phase-in process, that in itself should capture more and more companies, especially if they were to become of a certain size, to make very quantitative disclosures, and they need to start having at least a good sense of where their status quo is. So having, doing baby steps in terms of first looking at the inventory of what are the potential carbon emissions, and then doing some like baselining as well as moving into target setting later. So I think once we paint, a methodological or step-by-step approach in context of that requirement for them to comply anyway in the next 2-3 years, I think that in itself is a big impetus for them to start looking at it more seriously.
And also, Anna, I think it's not fair to say that every company in Europe is advanced. It's certainly not the case. I think, sustainability itself is just a name for a load of risks and opportunities. So when it comes to a company looking to enhance what they do in this space, it really is around how can you capture value for an organization, like a value creation is it customer segment? Is it accessing green finance so that you can actually reduce your overall debt, interest rates and debt within your company because you're accessing this extra finance? Have you got the right products to match the consumer need at this time? Do you have a resilient network? And do you want to sort of understand the physical risks across your portfolio to make sure they don't have downtime, or you're going to lose production, or you're going to create issues for your staff, etc.? So the framing, and it's just the reality, is that you can use it to create or grab more market share as an organization and private sector, and then to gain more market share. You can also downside protection, meaning you want to be able to keep producing, you want to be able to access a market because there's a regulation that's environmental, for example, right? And the world has moved a long way in 20 years, and it's moved to a point where now in the task force of climate-related financial disclosure, for example, on climate change or on nature or on other types of topics and soon to be social, these are topics that basically are just risk-driven. Whether you call them ESG or something else, they're still risks, and every company has a duty of care to manage them. We see boards being fired and CEOs removed because perhaps they were damaging some sensitive sites on land in countries. And therefore, these are real issues. They impact customers, they impact your lenders. and that impacts the localities that you operate in. And a footprint is just a tool. It's a mechanism to understand the size of your problem, whether it's emissions. It could be human rights related issues in terms of your supply chain or other topics. So it's just good risk management. It's good opportunity and growth and strategy development processes. And so in terms of companies, don't have the lens of it's more cost, it's more effort, what's the minimum? Look at it as an opportunity to grow and scale, but also to engage a workforce that is bound to your beliefs and values. And therefore they have an identity because they see this as a need in the market and themselves as individuals. So it's a broader discussion, and that's how we lead our projects and conversations.
Yeah, again, I just appreciate that kind of risk lens. Have you got anything to add to that, Andy?
Yeah, so in addition to the risk lens, I think Alex has alluded to a bit of that as well, is to really view decarbonization and broader sustainability levers in the context of also generating superior returns, right? Generating alpha, more than just making project life cycles more resilient, right? I think it itself or the developing South has also pretty unique big problem statements, things like waste circularity, agricultural food supplies for a growing population, energy demands. In a sense, emerging markets have a lot of opportunities for early movers. As companies think more mid to long term, whether they need to pivot to something or add an additional complementary revenue stream of income, then instead of viewing, sustainability as a cost, look at it as a opportunity to be an early mover. Initially, you might be required to put in some investment costs, but I think if they were to incorporate climate, social, nature, biodiversity, waste, even certain more nascent, challenging topics, if they were to have a good sense of how it can be incorporated into business, then potentially there's a huge market for them to capitalize that. And of course, even I think in classical traditional financing, the mainstreaming of sustainable finance is still becoming more and more prevalent. I think it's quite clear that all banks, at least most banks, will have a sustainable finance framework. And that in itself is an opportunity to either defray the cost or as a kickstart or incentive to embark on some sustainability measures. So indeed, the traditional financing mechanisms have already good structures to help corporates think about this. So again, is to move away from really that compliance or risk angle to more what's in need for me in the long term and how can I capitalize on these opportunities.
To really see it as a driver for your business rather than regulation or something that you have to do. I just have to ask you though, when you do open the paper nowadays, or if anyone is opening a physical paper, but if you read something online in the newspapers, it is very negative about sustainability. And you are hearing that companies are leaving, again, these alliances. They are not talking. I think Bloomberg did a little bit of they're listening in to companies doing reporting now Q1, and no one is mentioning ESG anymore. Are we seeing companies taking a step back in this kind of environment, or is it greenwashing that we've been talking about before, that people are just not talking a lot about it? Shouldn't you talk about sustainability during your earnings call anymore? Why do we find ourselves in this situation? And are we taking a step back, Alex, do you think?
We all think on the face of it, of course, like you can see campaigns against companies using certain terms. I think the reality is the term is just a name for a set of risks that you have to manage. And you have a duty of care, whether you're a pension fund in Florida or whether you're private equity or whether you're a company, you must manage risk on behalf of shareholders and investors. And they're not going away. In fact, it's getting a lot worse. Insurance, as I mentioned, premiums are up massively, claims are up astronomically. And that's based on, in this case, climate change as one of the major impacts and drivers. So that doesn't go away. So there are definitely companies that are being less public about what they're doing. They still want to retain their staff. They still want to bring new talent into companies as a differentiator. And people's beliefs around many of these topics, the inherent energy resilience, mitigation, contribution to nature, protection of biodiversity, and these things are still important for us and our children going forward. So there's a political reality at the moment that there is certainly a downplaying of some of these topics. I think you understand, or you can understand, why some companies are doing it, of course, but there is a reality that the risks that are driving that don't go away. I mean, remember, environmental law itself have been added and have been refined over the years as a result of killing people, like mercury in the groundwater, for example. There are laws around pollution and use of that. Why? Because it kills people, and there's a law. And then you add to the law, and that's risk protection on a public social scale. If you start backtracking, you're going to have more events where you're going to kill people again against certain contaminants, for example. So in the end, there's a reality out the window, and there's what we read in the press. And of course, there's a political situation, and there's maybe a shift in that direction, or the train is moving in a slightly different direction, but the destination is still the same. We still have plastic problem. We still have nature problems. We have real issues going on demonstrably year on year, and they don't go away. And every company has a duty of care and a fiscal responsibility and fiduciary responsibility. And so I think maybe it's temporary, maybe it's permanent, but you still have to manage the risks and you still have to keep going.
Andy, do you think out here in Southeast Asia that we're a little bit less affected by these changes, and for example, that we can't use certain terms?
I don't think so. I think, but that's also a function because Southeast Asia is a bit behind, right, in terms of making these commitments and ambitions or articulating the same as compared to European peers, right? So I think in a sense it's because of the fact that generally corporates have not made such big ambitions anyway. So there's not much in comparison to sort of rollback. But as I also mentioned earlier, the fact that most governments have stayed the course in terms of sustainability disclosures, I think you can't really just do green hushing. Right? In fact, you might be penalized if you do that in the next 2-3 years. And you are encouraged to make disclosures rather than not do so. And also, I think generally, a lot of corporates also want to do it out of the fact that, at least in the region, there could be potential collaborations that could help support the decarbonization perspective. That in itself should also be an additional capacity for corporates to start disclosing so that they can perhaps be eligible for some grants or be eligible for sustainable financing. So in a sense, I don't see, really any pullback of sorts among Asian corporates. Yeah.
Interesting. I wanted to move on a little bit to voluntary carbon usage and carbon credits, because obviously this is something that is quite new to ERM. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the strategy behind this, Alex, and why you are now offering voluntary carbon credits to your clients and what that means.
Yeah, so as a consultant, we follow our clients, we follow their clients' need. And historically, it's been, can you help us on articulating why we should do something? And then it's, can you tell us what we need to do? And now it's how to do it and actually implementing. And we bought a PPA energy company in the US called Coho, and creating a solution for our clients that we can agnostically source credits from the market for our clients to help them execute. It's just a natural progression as our clients go on their journeys. And we, as ERM, again, it's trying to meet the need of the times. Now, of course, we find many of our clients are looking into projects and then looking into the longer term types of investments that would maybe align to some of the Article 6 discussions, and some of it is around more sort of forward contracts off takes as well as spot. If you continued or you have been retiring credits and continue to use them as part of your decarbonization journey, they haven't stopped. I mean, new entrants perhaps have been slowed down. Certainly existing companies continue, and it's just a logical next step. I suppose the differentiator for ERM is we don't own credits, we won't own credits, we agnostically look at the market. So we're just trying to help our clients. We're client-led, so we just try to help them navigate.
Yeah, interesting. Andy, are you seeing a lot of interest from your clients out here in Southeast Asia for using voluntary carbon credits as part of a net zero journey?
Yeah, I think there's increasing, I would say, appetite to use it as a tool in the overall mitigation strategy. Obviously, there's also been concerns in the last 1-2 years around integrity. But I think generally the consensus is things are tightening, things are shaping up. And definitely there hasn't been any change in what we are preaching, in that there is a hierarchy of where carbon credits sit in, really looking at the residual emissions rather than using it as a means of making net zero claims without that thoughtful process. But also maybe in terms of integrity-wise, we are seeing preferences and willingness to pay a bit more. Admittedly, not a lot more, but at least there's that appreciation that removal credits perhaps are more valuable or more for the right reasons, should be worth more. And even within the Asia context, some opportunities for corporates themselves to be looking at biodiversity or blue carbon or certain waste to energy, certain biomass kind of methodologies. So in fact, we're also seeing, because of the recognition that Asia possesses some interesting problem statements, that these businesses can play a part, both monetizing it from a business perspective, but also from a carbon credit generation perspective. And so in that sense, that opportunity finding has also opened them up to more willingness of making the whole carbon credit usage more palatable. So generally, there's more interest, I would say, and good to see that there is indeed also some willingness to pay more for high quality credits.
And many of the Asian countries are blessed with nature, and that can provide a huge opportunity to both develop and supply credits to the world, get it funded, and activate local populations that have a new and diverse income stream. So I think we see this all over, and we hope it continues.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have to ask though, Alex, demand for voluntary carbon credits have been slow it's increasing, but it could increase faster. And especially as we're heading towards 2030, we need to have a market that is working, in 2040 even more so, because we are seeing companies having targets. What do you think could really unlock demand? What is really needed to kind of get demand flowing for voluntary carbon markets and raising that important finance, like you say, for example, for the nature here in Southeast Asia?
So I think one is regulatory certainty. So as everything keeps changing in terms of what's allowed, not allowed, which methodologies are going to be accepted, which ones have a core carbon principle label, and it's still a moving world. So that is influencing and affecting financial flow. You can't price that in because it's sort of cliff edge risks, and it's hard to price it in. And therefore, I think there needs to be cohesion and confluence around the right methodologies in the right places with governments backing them. So I think you need certainty on the supply side and certainty that what is being invested in will still be valid in 10, 20, 30 years. On the demand side, certainly for the private sector, they need certainty that if they make a contribution, it's adding value to both the country they're in and that they won't get shot. If it's voluntary, it's very difficult if you're always being shot at, perhaps in the press. A lot of companies have good intentions. They want to do something that's right. They want to invest in something that has a wider benefit into populations and biodiversity and improving social issues, but they're worried, right? So I think there's a whole recognition that maybe there have been a few bad projects, but not every project is bad. You've got you're in the bond market, sometimes you get bad bonds that are issued incorrectly or whatever. There's a problem with the underlying. You don't shoot the bond market. And inherently it's voluntary because there wasn't a regulatory player stepping up and filling the void. The voluntary markets build it, perhaps imperfectly, of course. But there's a moment where actually there's a realization, well, let's get consolidation of those methodologies and structures so that they're dependable, and then companies can actually go with confidence into it. At that point, you can get some public finance in there and private finance coming into as an investable asset. The second one, and it's the same with any systemic change, is insurance. So whether it's the people buy houses or invest in houses, suddenly there was house insurance, and then you get a lender to come in. Health insurance, people would be injured at work, very difficult. They needed health insurance, and that allowed people to hire lots of people and not get sued. So in the end, you need insurance for systemic change. So I think the combination of insurance, regulatory certainty, and private sector not changing the goalposts would actually bring that together as a scaling mechanism.
Have you got anything to add, Andy? Of course, here in Singapore, we are talking about the carbon tax, where you can use 5% of your tax obligation and you can buy voluntary carbon credits. Are you following that? Are your companies that you're working with involved in looking for credits under the carbon tax? Would you have anything to share?
Yeah, I think it's obviously rising, but not punitive yet. But I would say 1 or 2 years' time, things might be a bit different. But I think what would really drive the overall usage would be regional policy collaboration. I think the fact that, for example, Singapore, right? I mean, we have signed really a bunch of MOUs, more than 15 maybe, even 6 implementation agreements. So I think these schemes or these regional collaborations are really good drivers for corporates, both supply and demand, to really pick up. I think in addition to, CCP labels or other high quality integrity stamp of approvals, any governmental collaboration in itself is a proof of concept, is a proof of confidence in the fact that credits can be transferred on a hit-moss basis. So I think that overall regional collaboration is really going to drive, and hopefully we see more projects coming through. And even on the scope 2, environmental attribute side of things, regional grids, regional power imports, energy transition mechanisms such as MAS traction, things like this are really, I would say, important in driving the whole decarbonization agenda, because there are now indeed possible pilots or possible use of carbon credits to finance that broader problem statement of how to abate fossil fuels or coal, right? So I think mechanisms like this should continue to accelerate, and that in itself should really create more supply and demand, more emphasis, even beyond the broader commitments to 2030 or net zero. So I think really hoping for that regional collaboration to accelerate and projects to come through those mechanisms.
Thanks, Andy. So I think we're nearing the end of this episode, and I wanted to just ask you, what would be your key message to a company that has not necessarily started on their sustainability journey, and then another message to a company that is really now faced with a few challenges in relation to, for example, not talking about what they're doing during the earnings calls and feeling the pressure that is out there in the media and the political landscape? What would be your key messages, Andy, to one of the starting, why should you start on this journey? And then for someone who is already very involved.
Yeah, so again, I think it's really to convince corporates that this is really a value creation exercise. There are new markets, new products, specific problem statements in Asia that are worth pursuing from a commercial angle. And through the process, you might also be able to find perhaps opportunities to generate credits. So that's one. I think also the realization that, the price of carbon is going to come through into your financial books, in the near future. I don't think we can avoid that, whether it's a sustainable disclosure obligation or whether it's through CBAM. That is going to be the new reality going forward. So I think it is definitely good to start looking at it. And definitely it's a big journey, but start with baby steps, looking at what are your carbon emissions currently, looking at setting some baselines. If you need help, you can look for those help even through some government agencies. They have, for example, in Singapore, one ESG portal. You can look at also peers, what they're doing, and just reach out to consultants like ourselves to have a second opinion. We'll be happy to guide you along. So really, it's going to be a phase-by-phase process, not to be overwhelmed, but really, again, look at it from a value creation perspective. Yeah.
Alex?
Yeah, I think for looking at the earnings call question you mentioned and how to frame it, I mean, in the end, it's ESG, by it, it won't by any other name. I mean, it is, you still have the risks in your portfolio, right? You still have employees being injured at work. You still have construction work where you might be damaging some sensitive areas and artifacts, for example, or you have a product that has some banned substance inside its chemical construct, and therefore you're selling it into a market, but then suddenly it gets cancelled, or you've been using PFAS, and I forget the acronym, but it's a chemical that's been used widely all over the world, but it's a contaminant. And you might have a construction site in a different country and you've got to clean it up, but that's got a massive liability. So you can call it what you like, you can call it a rabbit, but in the end, it is a collection of risks that you need to manage on behalf of your shareholders of a corporation. And you can call it what you like, but it's still there. And you want to be there in 10, 15 years for the investors and for the employees and for your company. And you need to manage and foresee what's coming. And what's coming is a regulatory environment that is pushing ever closer to this as being a minimum standard all over the world. So in the end, of course, we understand clearly why companies may be toning it down, but the risk is still there, and the activities and work will continue or should continue.
Great. Do you have anything last to add, Andy, on that?
Yeah, maybe one last thing. I think if we look at most taxonomies, I think we are in the early stages of a broader macro move. Most governments are looking at climate mitigation now. But, if you look at next 2-3 phases, they're all out there. We're looking at, things like adaptation, resilience. So these are other big themes that companies can already start to incorporate, whether at the product level or from a strategic level, how they can position for that. So in a sense, there is a clear pathway right out into the next 2050, 2060. And if companies were to just align it out of sound business reasons or just to be able to capitalize on new opportunities, that there are indeed new business paradigms around sustainability to be harnessed. So I think really move away from that compliance mindset, if anything.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice end to this episode, where we've been talking a lot about sustainability and why companies should get involved and really not hide away from any of the either regulation that is coming and the risks, of course, that Alex has been stressing several times during the podcast, which I think is really relevant, especially in the climate that we're in at this point. So with that, I say thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Andy, for joining in Singapore. And thanks, Alex, for waking up early in Germany and joining us here at ESG Decoded. And we're hoping that we will continue to see more companies embark on this sustainability journey in both regions.
Great. Thank you, Anna. It's a privilege. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit ClimeCo.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.